Good afternoon and welcome to BizTech's Asian Midday Market Watch, powered by the Smart Investor Singapore. It's Thursday, it's the 8th of December, and we have our regular Thursday guest, David Kuo, founder of the Smart Investor Singapore. David, good afternoon.
Selamat tengah hari, Brian. How are you?
Now, I'm good. Thank you very much, David. As always, lovely to have you on the show. Now, before we get your insights for today, we're going to take a look at how regional stock markets have performed, and also, firstly, how cryptocurrencies are performing. We start with Bitcoin, which is at 16,814. It's down 1.32%. Ethereum is at 1,229. It's down 2.7%. Now, looking across to regional stock markets, we've got the KLCI, which is down 0.19%, Shanghai, which is up 0.16%, the ASX All Ordinaries, which is down 0.63%, the Nikkei, which is down 0.51%, the Hang Seng is up 2.83%, and rounding up the numbers, we've got the Kospi, which is down 0.84%. David, give us your take on what's happening across Asian markets in the first half of the day.
Okay, with the exception of the Hang Seng in Hong Kong, I would say the markets are kind of directionless. They were hoping for some kind of guidance from the US last night, and I don't think they got anything at all. So markets are treading water right now. They don't want to buy, they don't want to sell, apart from Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a special case because there are rumors, there is talk that Hong Kong may relax even further its restriction movement. So what they're saying is that maybe people will be able to go about a bit more freely, and that is generally sort of quite good for Hong Kong stocks. So what we actually saw, not only in the Hang Seng, but there are some Hong Kong related stocks here in Singapore. So we saw Jardine Matheson up, we saw Mandarin Oriental up, we saw also Hong Kong Land up. So these are the counters that we can look at here in Singapore. And by the way, I own all three of them, and it's been a terrible time for me owning all three of those stocks. But finally, there is some light at the end of the tunnel, Brian.
Now, David, all investors' eyes really are around the Fed decision next week. But basically, also one of the key data points that comes out next week is US inflation data. Now, walk us through some of this and what your thoughts are in terms of what the expectations are for the Fed rate hike, because everyone seems to be baking in a 50 basis point hike.
It is, well, those inflation numbers, Brian, are not just the key data. It is the only data really that the Federal Reserve is concerned about. It is looking at those CPI numbers, and at the last count, it was north of 7.5%, 7.7% inflation rate. So anything worse than that, anything higher than that, I think the Fed will step in and act very decisively. Anything lower than that, then of course the Fed will still step in, because 7% inflation rate does not sort of chime with the current Fed fund rate. So the Fed is going to have to increase interest rates regardless. The question is, how much are they going to increase those interest rates by? Now, a lot of people in the market are saying maybe it's going to be a 0.5 percentage point. So 50 basis point increase at the next Fed meeting before the end of this year. But if those inflation numbers are bad, Brian, then I don't think the Fed has any choice but to even go as high as 75 basis point, which is really going to shock the market. But if you listen to what Fed Chair Jerome Powell has been saying, inflation is the key. He's got to get inflation down. If he allows okay, let's say the CPI numbers are bad and he goes with what the market says, 50 basis points, we're all going to turn around and say, hey, you've lost the plot, right? You've lost your credibility. You said you're going to control inflation. Inflation is bad, and yet you are still going to go with 50 basis points. So I think people are going to be watching those inflation numbers very, very closely. And from that, they will be able to decide whether it's going to be 75 or 50 basis point at the next Fed meeting.
Now, but David, there are already signs that the US consumer is impacted in terms of spending. So Wells Fargo and and Bank of America CEOs have pointed out that there's cooling consumer spending amid all these Fed hikes. Also, there's something interesting that you brought to my attention, David, was really the soaring theft in the retail space in terms of shop thefts in the US. Now, that's an interesting statistic that you're looking at. Also, tell us a little bit of what brought you to look at those sort of statistics to give us clues that are perhaps not so obvious to the average investor.
Okay, I mean, as far as the economists are concerned, I mean, they are obviously looking at things like retail spending. They look at credit card transactions, which is really what the two banks have actually said, that the amount of spending that is placed on either credit or debit cards is beginning to show signs of slowing down. So that much we do know. Shoplifting, on the other hand, is what we call in the trade scuttlebutting. And this comes from an old pirates term when pirates used to stand around the water barrel, and they would be talking and they would be chatting. Today, we call it the water cooler. Yeah, in the office, people stand around the water cooler and they chat about all sorts of things. Generally, if you listen to what these people are talking about, they give you some kind of insight as to what is going on in the real world. And they give you a real-time look at what is going on in the real world. And shoplifting is something that two retailers in the US have highlighted as being a problem. One being Walmart, the other being Target. And they're saying that shoplifting is on the rise, and they are very concerned about the amount of shoplifting that is going on. And what they also said was that if they start losing stock from their shops, then they probably have no alternative but to raise prices to cover the stock that is being walked out through the front door without being paid for. And so they may also be forced to close stores as a result of shoplifting. Now, what is shoplifting all about? Is it a fun thing that people do? Maybe in some cases, you might say yes. You know, people think I'll go into a shop and put something in my pocket and not pay for it. But I think this is pointing to a more serious problem, which is that people are not being able to afford to buy things, Brian. I don't know what it is where you are, but I remember in the UK, the cashiers now are trained so that when people come up to the conveyor belt with their shopping, they may only have £50 or £30 or £20 in their wallet or their purse to pay for stuff. And so they put the stuff, they put their purchases onto the conveyor belt, and then they say to the cashier, can you stop when it reaches £20, right? Because I don't have any more money than that. And that is the situation that I saw back in the 1970s, you know, when people were so strapped for cash that what they had to spend was what they had in their back pocket. There was nothing else. And so I think shoplifting is pointing to a more serious problem in that consumers are finding it very difficult at the moment to make ends meet. And maybe they are forced into, I don't know, when you go hungry, Brian, I mean, you need to eat, right? And
absolutely.
If you can put, you know, something into your back pocket and walk out of the shop with it, you've got to put food on the table. And I think this is what scuttlebutting is all about, listening to what is going on in the real world. And I think for investors out there, sitting at your desk and looking at your laptop and spreadsheets doesn't actually help you invest. If you want to invest, you've got to be out in the marketplace. If you're investing in a real estate investment trust, a REIT, go and have a look to see how the REIT is doing, right? Go and have a look at your office REIT or your retail mall REIT or your healthcare REIT and see if there are actually people in the offices, people in the shopping malls, in the hospitals and surgeries. That will tell you what's going on in the market. Don't wait for 3 months later before the results come out from these companies and they tell you how they're doing. Have your nose on the ground, yeah, and listen to what is going on.
David, on that note, thank you very much for your very interesting insights today. And as always, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Now, we've been speaking to David Kuo, founder of the Smart Investor out of Singapore, on BizTech's Asian Midday Market Watch, powered by the Smart Investor Singapore. I'm Brian Fernandez. This interview will be on our website, www.biztech.asia, as well as our social media platforms. It'll also be on our syndication partners, TV stations, radio stations, and websites. Thanks a lot for tuning in.